This is the Black Anglo-Saxon
with Inquisitive Q.
and we're here today on the Eavesdrop. And today we will be talking about the coronavirus. All right, the first thing we wanted to touch on though, in terms of the coronavirus is the industries. And I wanted to touch on the industries, just because a lot of people have been saying, they don't necessarily fear it, or, it may be a super flu strain or anything that, what I feel like kind of dismisses the severity of the situation, not only around people's health physically, but I don't think people who make those claims about, not necessarily fearing it understand the implications that it also has within the market. And so today I wanted to kind of touch on some of those points and some of the sciences around the actual coronavirus. So to talk about the industries, I'll first start with, of course, I think the biggest one being at this point now, Capitol Hill closing down, because just during the week, Capitol Hill actually shut down all of its business, its non-essential business, along with the stock market making some minimal closures, and the NBA coming on top of that as a multi-billion-dollar industry that actually suspended its season indefinitely as it pertains to reeling in any possible coronavirus cases that they may have within their staff as well as the players. And then also in some cases, nations have shut themselves off, which affects the trade. But I also wanted to hear, and you can chime in and give me your take in terms of how you feel as though people have been approaching the conversation, and just your overall take on it and how you kind of responded to it.
I kind of have a smirk on my face because when I talk about the workforce a lot, because I always talk about social capital. And when you get down to the workforce health, the chronic diseases that we have in America, like heart disease, diabetes, these are issues that are ongoing, that are pressing, that do not get the press that coronavirus is getting. And one of the reasons I think that it is because coronavirus or COVID-19 has this threat that it can happen to other people. So it's like what affects one person also affects me, and that's how markets are also treating it. Mm-hmm. That if this market has it, then this could affect my market. But at this point in time, because I won't say the reality because I'm not a medical professional, I won't say the reality of people dying from it isn't a serious reality, especially for our vulnerable populations. But the level of response that we have seen, given that the flu season is literally a season and can be predicted. We don't have the healthcare policies in place because paid sick leave is one of the things that's going on. As far as policy, when we talk about the Hill and people want making sure that we have sick leave, because people not being able to have sick leave means that they have to risk going out into the world to potentially catch the virus or spread the virus because they don't have the economic fortitude or the money to sit back and wait it out.
And I want to touch on that just a little bit, because I think sometimes we misunderstand how, these ripple effects kind of work. And in a situation like this, I know in DC and in other places, they just mandated that there's no gatherings over 1,000 people. And so even when you look at 1,000 people, those 1,000 people, especially in the city of DC, where politics is one of our biggest markets and industries, you have people who navigate in a certain way because of that market, and they interact with people. So from that 1,000, 500 may go on to engage another 100 people just throughout the day. And so when you look at the numbers, and for me, where it came into is the actual rate at which people are catching it, because it's one thing to have or not be a serious disease, but it's both, as well as you and I know, in developing nations or third world nations, or however you want to identify them, you know, you have people who die from diseases like that us as Americans may see as trivial, such as like a diarrhea, as you mentioned earlier. When it goes untreated, it leads to the potential cause of death. And so when we think about, you know, people, for those people who might have that stance, it's just like, yeah, you know, but if everybody is catching it and if everybody is getting treated at the same time, in Italy at this point, they have come down to making decisions between the younger and the elderly due to the capacity in which they are not able to treat everybody who comes into it because they've been exhausted within the physical infrastructure of the industry itself. Not in terms of the money, because you can have the money to build, but in terms of the pace that the disease and people are catching it, it's hard to pace that with in terms of, you know, building a structure to actually house those people. So you see some places using infrastructures that are already in place. And I wanted and I want to keep it around industries for just a little second longer, because I don't think that people are really giving as much seriousness to how it will impact us economically, not only individually, but also as a nation. As when you have nations who, you know, provide certain goods or certain pieces to the goods that we use, say like what's a import that come, well, no, a lot of imports and goods come from China, but just other places, because I know El Salvador just announced something as well. So not even just, you know, those tangible things, but even in terms of when you talk about food,
avocados from Mexico.
Yeah, and not being able to say access those things over an extended period of time, because we got March 31st, and just for transparency, I'm a dad, so having a child who's out for 2 weeks, luckily I'm in a more fortunate situation than most people, but I also now have to work around a 2 week telework schedule with a child, and I don't think people understand that there's people even beneath me in terms of their economic placement in how they can navigate the situation based on just the resources that they have, and the ripple effects that it may cause. And having lived in abject poverty, knowing and understanding that it can be, you know, small things that set off, you know, very, very large series of events that lead to a person, you know, may not necessarily having something that's essential. Luckily, here in DC, they're trying to get some legislation passed around people not being able to have writs or write writs, and also utility shutoffs. So a writ is going to be when a landlord is seeking to evict a person from the property for lack of payment or any other reason that they deemed, whether it be contractual agreements or not. And so DC is trying to mitigate people being homeless during the crisis by putting restraints on the courts to be able to, you know, grant these writs.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Okay. In response to that, in one of the industries, I say avocados because, you know, I wouldn't say my social network, but most of my engagements are in that more the intersectional Black POC, and you already know we got a whole thing with that. The non-Black POC, the Black POC is more international. Mm-hmm. So it's better for me to talk about food. It affects people brunch. And it sounds so bad, but it's true. In DC, this is hard to explain for a lot of people who are here, but for those who are viewing this who aren't in DC or familiar with DC's landscape, you have a very flat like skyline.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of DC exists in the imagination of the people here. So the people you're talking about who are on the lower socioeconomic ladder, they're feeling the immediate effects of it. The people always who are at the extremes or the margins of a society feel it first, and that's when you get those cries, because those I'm used to hanging around, they don't get it. They to a large degree, like Christopher Hedges talks about not being around professors at Princeton, they don't necessarily get why it's so important to have childcare or to have a family structure in which, okay, grandma has the kids now because we don't have childcare or there's no mass gatherings. Going back to the whole thing about Italy and the physical infrastructure and bringing it into brunch. Not only that it's more expensive if they allow avocados to come out of Mexico, because you have the customs agreements, because people are trying to mitigate, or I should say, his estate are trying to do their best to mitigate the risk, and therefore the passage of goods across is just going to be more stringent, and therefore it's going to take more time for people to get things. Somewhere along the way, someone is going to have to pay the cost. So my point is if you don't take care of the people who need childcare and make them feel comfortable enough that if we have things like this happening, then you're adding stress onto their life. Stress also influences the immune system.
Agreed.
And when you have people who live with chronic stress and live inside of food deserts, and I keep bringing up food for a reason, food deserts, they don't have the health to combat things. So we may look at risk populations as just elderly or children, but you also got to look at those who don't have access, one, to regular health care, who don't have a regular health physician, who are overworked, who live in chronically stressful environments. The lack of concern in advanced economies or developed economies like America for those who live, and we just talking about DC. Mm-hmm. DC is privileged in the sense that we got money. As a municipality, we have money for these programs. But if you in somewhere like Michigan, if you're in the Red Sea where they don't have industry like that, you're going to be like Italy. You have to choose, okay, this is the amount of resources that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, the elderly are more likely to be harmed, so let's go ahead and do it this way versus that way. And then that's when it comes down to, and I want to go there, not everyone can have their way. There's a certain level of duty that has to be taken amongst our generation. I mean, what I mean by our generation, I'm not using the millennial term, I'm using digital natives. Those between the age born 90 and 96. We are transitioning into the age where responsibility is a thing, and we want to have to take risks. So going back to the virus and markets, yes, I may be healthy enough to go out to brunch, but when I go out to brunch and this whole political, everyone's an activist, am I going to talk about how I'm going to put in legislation to make sure that those at the margins of society get paid sick leave, even as part-time workers, so that they don't have to expose themselves to viruses, which, although they may be sick for a little bit while, those financial ramifications, it becomes even a deeper burden on the family and a deeper burden on the local society, which the states have to contend with.
And I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you interrupt me.
But I want to touch on something that you brought up in terms of stress, and it made me think about America as a whole. And it made me ask myself a question in regard to, do we as America and Americans have the cultural capacity to pivot? Because as we know, institutions are about culture, markets are a conglomerate of institutions. And so when you talk about stress and we talk about the workforce and we talk about how those things are mechanized in terms of 9 to 5s, in terms of having the gig economy, having people work 2, 3, and 4 jobs just to meet the necessities in life in this society at this point, and still not having disposable income. So to add on to the infrastructural issues and issues around the healthcare capacity, when you talk about stress and food deserts and people not having access to healthy foods, that dampens the actual immune systems. It weakens you, and so you just become that much more of a prime host for when you come and interact with this actual disease. And again, you may be or you may believe that you're a relatively healthy person because you navigate, day in, day out. But just the levels of stress that we, as especially Black Americans, are induced with, to the point that there have been studies that talks about how much stress we take on. We have a shorter life expectancy, like we have higher rates of high blood pressure and all of those different things due to our stress levels. So and going back to the original question and conversation around people taking it serious, there's a myriad of things, especially as we span on. We have the elections going on, which also is, creating a source of stress, given how everything has panned out, all of the candidates and all of the things that we've seen during this political cycle. And so you have a myriad of things influencing and creating hosts in our environment, but then you also have, on the same side of capitalism, you have the direct market, and the way that it functions, is just heavily abusive to the average worker. You talk about people working long days, not being able to even extend and be able to take care of those family needs. So when you talk about doing telework, or people even not having the possibility to telework, it creates just a combination of issues. I don't think that people are assessing it as a whole, but rather in a vacuum, which I believe that, a lot of the times we assess things in that manner, and I think it provides those blind spots. But I just wanted to touch on those just in terms of, being at risk before we move into the gig economy, which is like the last part of what I want to kind of talk about in terms of markets. Because when we talk about creatives, when we talk about the creative economy, when we talk about, people just trying to make, whether it be Uber, DoorDash, Instacart, or any of these means that people use to supplement their income and supplement their lifestyles, we're going to see large rifts in those two. And those people, I'm also very, very, very interested in seeing how we're going to pivot out of this. And I do have very much care, just based on, I don't see, if it's not contained within a decent time frame, you're talking about Uber drivers being put at risk at higher rates, because again, you're now driving around people who may be carriers of the disease. You're talking about people not necessarily going out to movie theaters, going out to shop as much. You're talking about delivery services. You had something that you were looking at the other day in terms of them not being able to even give a delivery date for the actual good itself, based on everything that's happening around the coronavirus. And so to everybody who is an influencer, to everybody who uses a lot of these networking spaces to build their capital and build their brands, it doesn't look very good in terms of them managing through, because to manage through, you also then have to put yourself at risk. So you don't have the luxury of kind of stopping either.
But this, will you finish?
Yeah.
Okay. This is where sometimes I kind of wish I took a different track in life. If I was in the technology space.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was leading in automation, this would be my time to sell. And I'm selling the idea to get people to buy in. If we had autonomous vehicles that could be relied upon to deliver supplies to people, it'll make it easier, not necessarily a good thing, but it'll make it easier to ration out toilet paper. Because now you have autonomous vehicles, and the only points of contact that's truly there is between, people say last mile delivery, but people want point to point delivery. Basically, I order something, I go out to an autonomous vehicle, I get it, almost like Amazon lockers at what they call Whole Foods, but it's really Amazon. At Amazon, where you go to the locker and you get your things. But to your point, even if I'm Lyft or if I'm Uber, autonomous vehicles. GM already has an autonomous vehicle that has no driver whatsoever. So if I have an autonomous vehicle that can pick people up and transport those persons back and forth, and they come back to a cleaning station or they have something within and they're cleaning, it's just, my whole point is the fourth industrial revolution is how we want to pivot out of this. The gig economy. Because with the growth of data sets, and which is really important, the growth of data sets and the usage of data sets to understand how markets move and what people want inside of markets, when you have something like the coronavirus in which it is done by people, commerce doesn't have to stop because it's no longer so heavily involved with people point-to-point contact. So that means people want to lose jobs, but who cry about the person that doesn't have the elevator job? Get my point? Because I would use this to pivot into saying, if we had autonomous vehicles, we wouldn't have this problem, because then we can do this as a state, we can do this as a company. People can still order their things while they're inside of the house. Because look at Italy. Italy was quarantined. What did Italy do? They wanted to entertain themselves. They still had a party. We still got to remember that people are going to be people. They still want life to continue, although we're going through this virus. And if I was a person that was in a market position to say, with autonomous vehicles, we can still have commerce go on, going back to the telework, because telework is basically using technology.
I think my question to that would be, is I'm not naturally defensive against it, but how would you, and just off the top of your head, go about balancing that with the issue that we're having about, job loss due to autonomy?
Two countries, Singapore and Estonia. The reason I say Singapore, because Singapore seems to understand housing and education, especially when it comes to long-term education.
Mm-hmm.
Singapore helps people with their housing and build housing, and they also give people education credits for long-term education. Because whether we want to admit it or not, the industrial revolutions have always been disruptive. This is the fourth one, and it's going to make it that cognitive skills are going to be far more important than your motor skills, as to say if you were a mechanic or something, or the white collar skills, in which basically you would digest the information and come to a conclusion for people to make a decision about. Mm-hmm. So my point is that we have to focus on education. Going back to the original season, education in the sense of we're teaching people how to move through society as autonomous people who have the autonomy to make decisions within their interests, but also know that society is a prisoner's dilemma, meaning that it's in my best interest to make sure that you're taken care of so that you won't act in your self-interest that will eventually harm me. We have to do a whole level of socialization to understand that the people-to-people jobs is what needs to be prioritized in our education, and not just people learning how to take care of the mechanics of AI. So we really need to get down to our curriculum. We really need to emphasize that there is no such thing as you just graduated and you no longer have to deal with any learning material. Learning is going to be a part of the process. Now, in the short term, to answer your question, that really comes down to people and their local politicians. The Fed cannot mandate it, because we have to remember the United States of America, especially the manifest destiny, is freaking huge. The land mass is huge. If you're asking people who don't necessarily have the time to think about their home state and deal with the politics on the Hill to figure out what's going on back home, the people back home have to give them the information to come to the Hill. So people in North Dakota aren't having policies dictated to them from the federal level by people on the coast. And the coasties is a real thing. We have to stop ignoring the Red Sea because their political narrative doesn't fit the coastal narrative. Because jobs are basically on the coast. And that's why we have this big divide. In response, even in the response to the coronavirus. Because if you are in the middle of, and I don't want to say the middle of nowhere because it's insensitive, but like I said, the hood from the holler, if you are in a place that's impoverished but does not have the infrastructure of a big city, yes, being socially distant isn't as hard for you. But if you are sick, getting the basic necessities is harder because the infrastructure simply is not there for anyone.
Yeah, and even in terms of the medication, it's definitely going to be hard to get. And talking about medication and then talking about autonomy, to move into the sciences portion of it, to also put into perspective the time frames, I think, which are largely important in the conversation, because I don't think it's just a matter of, this happening within like a week and we know when it's going to pass. This is something that apparently they say that the virus has mutated twice from its original state. And then I know from what I've read, the actual scientist who passed away, who was 34 in Wuhan, came out with an article around November, December, warning us about the actual virus itself. And so when I actually read that, for me, it put me into a mind frame where it's like, okay, for him to have been studying that means the virus had to be around for at least, I'll give it to be reasonable, at least a month in advance in terms of knowing about it and trying to find a vaccine to prevent the spread or prevent the issue that we're having now, and just seeing how, they've stated that they might not necessarily find a vaccine until like a year out. And so what's your take around that?
My take is until we have something around patient zero, meaning like where it initially started, I can't necessarily confirm or deny any evidence because I haven't seen it. And one, I'm not a professional, so yeah. I would look for peer-reviewed journals to kind of.
Yeah, that's why I said this part is more like which are just your kind of take, because I know they quarantined Wuhan, the market in which it happened, and to my knowledge, I guess would that be ground zero? Or
you can say that is ground zero, that's site zero.
In terms of the outbreak, but like you said, he had the actual, or he was prepping on working towards a vaccine, so we might not know.
Because I saw some initial reports, to answer your question, I saw some initial reports saying that it come from bat soup, and that's where it was coming from. And so it transferred from bats into humans, and because it did that, diseases that are able to transfer from animal to animal are more vicious. But to your point about the mutations and so forth, that goes back to everything I've been saying. It's like the food, the pharmaceuticals, the chronic disease, the workforce. And I don't want to come off as dismissive, because I'm not dismissive in how this is impacting people's lives. But I do want to stress that this is just one event that has gathered a lot of attention. Because as we go forward, viruses will continue to come, especially if we allow the permafrost, which holds a lot of ancient bacteria inside of it, out. It's like the cat is kind of out the bag now, as far as we live in a global economy. And globalization really means that things move fast. So, to answer your question directly about the timeline of things, until we have the after fact, the precautions that have been taken by industries, by nations, I understand. The precautions that have been recommended by doctors and the World Health Organization, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the timeline of the virus and knowing what the virus will do, it's a virus. It's living. It mutates. It grows. Science, and we've seen antibiotics being developed by AI. I go back to AI. It's like the answer is going to be, and a lot of people are going to do it because what AI is able to do is take large statistical data and make it far more precise. Stanford has already did this. Vaccines take a long period of time, and women will know this because the complexity of the human body, especially when it comes down to women's health, the managing of pain, most of the pain medicine is made for white men. So when it comes to managing the pain, the nervous system is different between men and women.
Right.
So when we start talking about the cis and trans conversation, which is happening in women's sports, there's a certain level of biological elements that doesn't feed into essentialism, but that's a whole nother thing. So my whole point is getting to the vaccine is going to take time because it takes time to build the data and the information to process it, to see how you move forward, because this is just one virus that they have to contend with. The flu is still here. Diabetes is still here. Chronic heart disease is still here. So it's not, oh, we need to focus on the coronavirus. It's like, no, you need to focus on the coronavirus and the flu and heart disease and childhood diabetes and this. It's like until we really become serious about people's health and understanding that the time it takes for the body to recover and that sleep is essential to health. Absolutely essential. And what disturbs sleep is stress. Until, as a society, we take seriously that the health of the nation is the wealth of the nation, and not the wealth of the nation is the prestige of the nation. Meaning that GDP does not mean that it's a great nation because it has a high GDP. It's a great nation because it has a healthy population.
Because the higher the GDP, unfortunately, the way that it's been mechanized, the unhealthier your people are possibly off. Because again, we talking about how just the system of capitalism in terms of exploiting the labor, wage suppression, that being generational and historical in America, just all of the myriad of things around that conversation alone in creating and actually making the factors worse, I think is astronomical. But I think to, wrap it up for us and just also to want to hear other people's, take on whether they think it's serious or not, because I've been seeing, some mixed. And just for me personally, again, it's a thing of like, it's debatable whether or not, it's blown out of proportion. We've had that debate in terms of, in some ways, yes, I do feel like it has been blown out of proportion. But as I said, I think especially when we're dealing with the electorate, I don't think they take enough accountability in terms of acknowledging the fact that the same media that has blown this out of proportion is the same media that they've given the agency and the clout to be able to run false narratives time and time and time again. And they actually stick because we live under a notion of, it is what it is. And so, yes, it may be the case that it's blown out of proportion, but we also have to, especially speaking from the perspective of like being a Black American male, I think it's very apparent that people would take and pay attention to what's happening economically in terms of the markets, because it might have after effects in terms of how you are able to navigate. We don't know what policies might come out of this. I just read a report earlier where they said that the GOP tried to sneak an abortion clause within the coronavirus bill. That's something I'll look into a little bit later. But again, it's just stuff like that. You never know with these type of situations and how people want to leverage the chaos and how people want to leverage the famine, as we have systems built on monetizing the actual stress of society. And to save time, we're not going to go into that. That may be a whole nother video in terms of how, because the whole opioid crisis, we created it and then we created the medicine that, helped it. But any last words from you?
Basically, just to encapsulate everything you said, you're taking it from the legal perspective. For me, I bring it always back down to the local. And it's coronavirus just opened Pandora's box to globalism. And it showed the ugly side of globalism that we can't control. So as we move forward in the 21st, it's kind of going to be really important for us to understand as people that our neighbor is no longer just the person to our left and to our right or across the street from us. Our neighbor is halfway across the globe. This has been Inquisitive Q of the East Drop.
The Black Anglo.
We out.